this to me is like the really fascinating material.
We don't know what the answer is, but we're looking for patterns.
I think we're looking at kind of a type of cosmic alchemy.
The story slowly differs.
But still, a lot of people don't know that this technology actually exists.
The possibilities here are pretty
We
mind-boggling.
can't just believe that it was the work of these lone, troubled individuals.
And like a conspiracy theorist would look at that and say, well, the Illuminati or somebody planned this way
Now, is
in
that
advance.
or is that by design?
Looking for meaningful coincidences.
The same pattern.
You're interfacing with your neural circuitry. They're mapping your electromagnetic field and they interface it onto an artificial intelligence that races.
We're here on Conspirinormal, guys. It's yet another show. This is episode 259.
Oh man.
I know. And we are Robless. He may be dead in a ditch somewhere. We're not really sure. Or maybe on his easy chair,
Yes.
chilling.
We are hunkered down in Studio B, ready for the
Yeah.
apocalypse.
We got bongo drums. We got hypnotizing self-help records. Walter, welcome back to the show. By the
Yes.
way, we got Walter Bosley. Do you know?
Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely, it's always a pleasure to have you. I mean, you definitely are a good friend of the show, and I think this may be like part 65 of the Walter Bosley experience. I'm playing with actually taking all the interviews of yours because I've posted everything on YouTube now, along with the iTunes version or whatever, but I don't. But that was only from like episode 196 or something. So I think I've got 2 or 3 of your interviews on YouTube, but I'm thinking about putting the rest of like all the ones we've done and just having a playlist of nothing but your stuff, because that's how important I think that your material is.
Oh, wow.
But
Well, hey, I'm flattered. Thank you.
But I was going to ask you about. Do you know anything about self-help hypnotism?
No.
All right. Sergio got some kind of weird, like, what is it that you got? What is that?
Oh, it's just, some of that weird New Thought businessman stuff from mid-century, and it's like a self-hypnosis into success. So it's like, telling you how you're already rich. And you're supposed to go to sleep and listen to it. It's on blue vinyl. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, we were listening to it earlier, and we thought we all of a sudden had this idea to go kill the Pope or something. It was kind of weird. But that's actually, that stuff, mind control is actually kind of an element of this book, believe it or not, on the Esoteric Napoleon, which is what we're talking about tonight. Like I said, we've done, I think, an interview for just about every book you've written at this point. And so this is Secret Missions 4. I think we combined a few. I think the Empire of the Wheel books, we may have combined them all in one interview. But Secret Missions 4. So how did this come to be a Secret Missions book? And what interested you in writing about Napoleon? Because Napoleon is not someone that you think of normally as being like kind of like an esotericist.
Right, unless you've heard certain little apocryphal tales, one in particular. But basically, to answer your question, I never imagined, for the longest time, I never would have imagined myself writing a book about Napoleon Bonaparte. And some years back, about 15 years or so, a little longer, I guess almost 20, I had first heard the story about Napoleon spending the night in the Great Pyramid. And, where that intrigued me, I didn't know much about it. I didn't pursue much about it. And then over the years, the last 20 years, particularly the last 10 years, I became a little more interested in the Louisiana Purchase. And I learned about this mystery that Meriwether Lewis, one of the commanders of the Lewis and Clark expedition, was possibly murdered. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. And there's an author out there, I don't know if you guys know him or interviewed him, Xavier Hayes. He wrote a book about this, about, you know, the mystery of the murder of Meriwether Lewis. And I read that, and it began to really intrigue me in different ways about the Louisiana Purchase, from the point of view of, well, why would someone murder Lewis? Did it have to do with Louisiana Territory? You know, what's going on there? And then also we have, you know, those ancient American mysteries, you know, the possibility of a lost civilization that had been here before, you know, known history and all that such. Then there's Cahokia, of course, which is a little north of the boundaries of the Louisiana Territory, but, you know, still someone exploring, you know, could have gone that far north. Or were there other sites associated with the same civilization? And could this be, or could this have something to do with why Meriwether Lewis was murdered? Or did it have more to do with financial stuff and on and so forth? So that interest led to discussions with my good friend, Joseph Farrell. And about 4 years ago, we started discussing the mysteries of Louisiana Territory, the Louisiana Purchase, and we talked about Napoleon and what he might have been up to, and you know, what was his motive of selling the Louisiana Territory to the United States, which, you know, most people know that Jefferson got it at an incredibly, just ridiculously low price, and it doubled the size of the then United States. So, you know, thinking of Louisiana Territory, that mystery, and then also remembering this weird tale about this night that Napoleon allegedly spent in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid. And he allegedly comes out of the pyramid shaken and pale, and, you know, something obviously very weird had happened to him. But when he was asked about it, he told his people, you know, the person who asked him, that you wouldn't believe it if I told you. And that's it. That's all we have. And there's only, you know, like one obscure source for that, but it's a story that made the rounds. So these were the things that were bouncing around, you know, well, gee, what was Napoleon up to? What was he into? What, you know, what's going on there? What happened to him that night in the pyramid? And it'd been kind of in the back of my mind. I talked about it with Joseph a couple of times over the last few years. And last year, and the only reason I'm going into this long story, because it ended up having a huge impact on me. Last year, I was visiting Joseph, and he took me to his favorite used bookstore where he lives. And I found a book that would have served, that serves actually following up on my Cabrillo research from Secret Missions 1, right? Mm-hmm. So as I'm looking around the books, I find this other book that I've heard of, but I had never found. And there was a copy of it, one copy, and that's a book titled Bonaparte in Egypt by J. Christopher Harold. And I think it dates back to the 40s. But it's kind of a known book among, you know, nerds interested in this stuff. So I got it. I grabbed it. And as I started reading it, I began to realize that I knew virtually nothing about this man, Napoleon Bonaparte, other than the historical propaganda and the caricature that we have been served up for 200 years. You know, that Napoleon was a short megalomaniac who was sullen and glum and fat and balding and walked around with his hand in his vest. And, you know, he was just this big, monstrous, despot tyrant. And what I was learning, just initially jumping in with this one book, is that there was much more to this guy, and that he wasn't some short megalomaniac tyrant. He wasn't a tyrant at all, and he certainly wasn't a despot. And so and the other thing is, he was deeply, deeply interested in science and archaeology and ancient history, and, you know, the mysteries of history in the world. And I never knew that about the guy. You don't learn that in school. You don't
Yeah, I
learn
never
that in
knew that either.
the movies and the TV shows. Right.
Yeah.
And this was his first love. What I learned basically was, as I started reading about him, is that this man was a philosopher scientist, and he was very much interested in the mysteries of ancient history and old ancient places. And I had written 3 books in my Secret Missions series about 3 famous historical figures who I think were on this essentially same secret mission, and that was to search for the the lost technology of the forgotten civilization. And I realized, wow, Napoleon Bonaparte, it's looking like he was one of these guys. And I think what really convinced me right out of the gate was in this book, Bonaparte in Egypt, you learn that he appeared to manipulate the French government and the circumstances that indeed existed to back his expedition to Egypt. Okay? And yeah, he would go there and he would do things that would be good for France and, politically and power-wise and economically, but it appeared obviously to me that he was using these circumstances and all of this as an opportunity to go on this expedition, okay, to dig into the mysteries of ancient Egypt and, through archaeology and all this. And he took with him, what was it, 160 some of the top philosopher scientists, the archaeologists, the engineers, the artists, the anthropologists, all these same guys, okay, that would be experts in the disciplines that would be required in a search for the lost technology of the forgotten civilization. He took them and several hundred of their technicians, okay, and field personnel. He ended up taking 500 experts in the archaeological related sciences and all this stuff on this expedition. These were non-military people. These were civilians. His military staff was, some of them were just flummoxed. They were like, what the heck? And he treated these guys on the same level with the same level of respect as he did his officers. They couldn't figure out why initially. And he gets down into Egypt, and the rest I go into in the book, and it's kind of history. What he did, this expedition started modern Egyptology, as we know it. And this is the expedition wherein he spent time inside the pyramid. So by the time I finished reading this one book, I realized, well, I got to read more about this guy. He goes to Egypt not when he's fat and middle-aged and whatever. He goes when he's this like a young lion. He's not even 30 years old,
right?
And he's slim and young and vibrant. He's got long hair to his shoulders. He's not, he's not the caricature that we know. And it seems like every move he makes can be paired up with some archaeological discovery, or some site or relic. So it became clear to me, my gosh, I think this guy is, I think he's on one of these secret missions that I write about. And the more I read, the more convinced of that I became. So I realized early on, that this is it. This is I've got to do this. I got to dig into this. This guy's the next subject of the Secret Mission series. And as I was in the writing of the book, not long before I finished it, I realized, okay, I'm not going to be able to, in this first volume, put everything that I found or pull every thread. So I realized shortly before finishing the book that I was going to need a second volume. And, of course, I started the preliminary research on that. But it was really after reading the Herald book and then jumping in on another book that theorizes that Napoleon would have come to America, and it talks about the Bonapartists in America and such. And by the time I read those two books, I was convinced that Napoleon Bonaparte was on his own personal secret mission, as it were, personal quest.
To ask about a little background about this invasion of Egypt for people to kind of understand this. Why did Napoleon go to Egypt? What was the purpose? And then also, too, you mentioned in the book that there is this papyrus that is found that apparently plays some kind of key role. And also, as Napoleon is going to Egypt, the Knights of Malta are involved with all this, too.
Yes, indeed. Yes, ostensibly, and it is true, it is a fact. Napoleon, at the time that he went to Egypt, was a rising star, okay? He was undefeated in battle, and he had invaded and conquered Italy for France, and quite frankly, he did scare some people back in France who, had designs, on power for themselves and such. So you have Napoleon wanting to go to Egypt, and I'm going to get back to the papyrus in a second. You have Napoleon wanting to go to Egypt, and you have France wanting to expand its influence and its empire, okay? And you have Talleyrand and others who would love for this young hotshot rising star to be, thousands of miles away out of France.
Yeah, Talleyrand being the foreign minister of what then was the French Republic. Yeah,
exactly. So you had those three factors going on, and embedded within Napoleon being the guy who convinced the government to back this expedition was his personal quest. And of course, we'll get into that, but the book goes into the evidence supporting the idea that he indeed was on this personal quest. And that personal quest, I think, began in his youth because of his interests. He was interested in archaeology and ancient history from the time he was a kid. Okay, so I think he had it in his mind that he had to get to Egypt for years. Now, when he becomes acquainted with Gaspard Monge, and you'll hear me go back and forth between Monge and Monge because I'm not quite sure. When I see it printed, there's no accent over the E, so that would indicate that it's Monge, but sometimes, Anyway, when he meets Gaspard Monge in, I think, 1792, I'm pretty sure he met Monge before the mainstream historians say he did in 1797, 1798. I think the seed had been planted for him to go to Egypt that early. Now, for 20 years, there have been various individuals go to the French government to present, to propose an expedition to Egypt. And none of them had ever, been approved. None of them had ever actually been acted upon. There were several of them. And what Napoleon did when he finally did put his plan together, he took the best of Baron de Tot's. Baron de Tott was the first one, I think, to submit this in 1777. And he just changed a few things, one of them being instead of launching the invasion of Egypt from Crete, Napoleon wanted to do it from Malta. Okay, and I'll get back to the significance of that shortly. Now, during the Italian campaign, while Napoleon's got this in his head that he wants to go to Egypt, and while he and his mentor Gaspard Monge are certainly talking about Egypt and such, and these plans, Napoleon, in his invasion of Italy, is going around capturing works of art and sculpture, paintings, and documents, specifically documents that either belong to the Vatican or have some association to Vatican library type of stuff. And Gaspard Monge was one of the two guys, himself and I believe Berthollet, were delegated by Napoleon and the French government organization that they were associated with, which I forget the title. I don't have it sitting right in front of me, but basically they were in an organization that licensed them, chartered them, so to speak, to collect all the treasures, artworks, and information and technologies and those kinds of spoils of conquered territories. Okay? So as Napoleon's invading, with his army invading Italy, he's delegating Monge and Berthollet to go around collecting all this stuff. And comes the day when Monge presents to him a captured papyrus that is 1,100 years old. Okay? We don't know what was in the papyrus. It's interesting that history tells us about Monge presenting this to Napoleon, but it doesn't tell us what was in it, what was written on it. So it's not long after that Napoleon makes his proposition to the Directory for an Egyptian invasion, and they gather all the resources, the ships, and these 500 philosopher, scientist, technician types, okay? And off they sail to Malta to launch the invasion of Egypt from there. And the interesting thing about Malta is that there happened to be a fortress. Okay, the governors of the island, so to speak, were the Knights of Malta. Okay, and according to the history, when Napoleon and his forces had the island surrounded, and they were, demanding entrance into the harbor of Valletta, the commander of the Knights of Malta is the one who allowed them in. Napoleon later said that he would not have been able to land on Malta, conquer Malta, if the head of the Order of the Knights of Malta hadn't let him in. And when they arrived, the command structure of the Knights of Malta cheered their arrival. So, that was an interesting little thing there, that they seemed to be happy that Napoleon was there, even though technically he was invading. So they spend a short period at Malta. Napoleon does some, civic reorganization, makes it better for everybody that lives there. That was his habit, by the way, far from being a tyrant or a despot. And in the end, he ends up taking 34, I believe it's 34 members of the Knights of Malta, several of them actual knights, the rest being, support personnel, so to speak. And we get no description, no names of the specific knights he took with him. We get no description of what their specialty was, because, these guys just didn't sit around in armor with swords waiting to, go around and fight Barbary pirates or whatever, although they were involved with fighting Barbary pirates, but that's not all they did. I mean, just like in any, the Templar Order and others, they had their scientists and technician types, their engineers. And I suspect that it was these types of guys from the Order, these knights, that Napoleon invited to come along. He didn't force them. He recruited them. He talked them into it, and they're like, yeah, they were younger, of course, so they were capable of fighting. But, he recruits these guys from the Order, the Knights of Malta, and off they go to Egypt from there. Now, I suspect that while Napoleon was on Malta, it wasn't just his intention to recruit, some of the knights. I think that the knights were aware of some of the archaeological wonders that we are told, in the case of the hypogeum, were not discovered until decades later, later in the 19th century or the early 20th century.
Yeah, I don't see how they wouldn't be, because the knights were there for, over 200 years?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. The knights were there for a few centuries, and they didn't find the hypogeum. Give me a break.
And we're talking about a pretty secretive group.
Yeah, so I argue that they were aware of this, and I suggest that Napoleon Bonaparte probably got a little private tour of the hypogeum, And one of the reasons for that being, a legitimate speculation is that there's the hypogeum on Malta, and then there's there's multiple hypogeums in different places. They believe the original one, at least the oldest one found, being in Egypt. So here you have a number of reasons for Napoleon to stage his invasion of Egypt from Malta instead of Crete. Number one, the Knights and what they knew, about ancient history. Because remember, the Knights of Malta, okay, when the Templar Knights were disbanded and persecuted, the Knights of Malta were one of the main beneficiaries of Templar assets, and that includes information, okay, records and files and books. They also absorbed some of the actual Templar Knights, because once that order was dissolved, not all these guys gave up being knights by any stretch of the imagination. They just joined different orders, and some of the Templars joined the Knights of Malta. But the Knights of Malta got a lot of Templar intelligence and information and records, and that would include, okay, whatever it was the Templars got out of that notorious Fourth Crusade, which, ended up being the sacking of Constantinople and its version of the Library of Alexandria, which would have included scrolls and books and information that had been from the Library of Alexandria. So the Knights of Malta, we're talking that kind of information about the ancient world, okay? So that right there, and here we have Napoleon Bonaparte being practically cheered as he invades their island, and then he easily convinces 34 of these guys from the order to go with him to Egypt. I think the reason for that is that they had expertise in what he was looking for, and they were willing to jump at the chance to get down there and dig into it a little bit. That's just one. Number two, Napoleon either suspected or knew that he was going to be looking into things like hypogeums, and somehow, probably through Gaspard Monge or other Masonic influences and associates in his life, he knew that the hypogeum was on Malta. The Knights of Malta showed it to him, and he that's probably reason number two why he went to Malta, because he knew or suspected he was going to encounter some of the same types of ancient sites in Egypt as one finds on Malta. So, there's, of course, yet another reason. And of course, its strategic location is not bad either. And that he would use, for instance, you're convincing your country, hey, back my expedition. And by the way, I'm going to go from Malta, not Crete. Well, why Malta, Napoleon? Well, hey, look, it's a strategic position. It's an island in the Mediterranean, and, it'll help us, kind of going against the British and having more assets than them and on and so forth. It just works logistically. And of course the government will say, oh yes, very good, excellent, okay. You don't need to tell the government that there's these ancient ruins and mysterious hidden sites there that you want to go see. You don't need to mention that at all.
And of course,
you just
Egypt would be strategic too, because even though there's no Suez Canal at the time, you pretty much are cutting Britain off from India. I think that was the goal. And I think he had some kind of goal to actually go all the way to India.
Sure, yeah. In fact, that makes sense to me that eventually he would have.
Yeah.
But what happened was, something he experienced and figured out in Egypt sent him back to France pretty quickly. But remember, he was also asked multiple times to return to France early, because the people that ultimately pulled off the coup that put him in the first consul seat, they needed him back. He needed to get back there. Historians have long accused Napoleon of abandoning his expedition, abandoning his army, abandoning Egypt, and he did not. There were very legitimate reasons for him to leave when he did. But here's the funny thing: he still spent, like a year there. So, the accusations of abandonment are just one more thing on the pile of propaganda and lies told about him.
And he went on to Palestine too, as well. That's the other part of the which I guess.
While he was over there, he was going all over that place, which I go into in the book, and I think he did while there.
Well, let's get into. There was some debate on whether or not Napoleon actually went into the pyramid or not. So let's get into that, and then also too, what do you think that it was he was looking for inside the pyramid? What could this experience have been?
That was one of the more fun parts of the book when writing it, and yet the most the most technically difficult part of the book, because I needed to make sure I was getting things right. Now, the question had been, did Napoleon go into the pyramid and ever spend a night in the pyramid? And we have J. Christopher Harold, the author I mentioned before, who wrote the book Bonaparte in Egypt, claiming that he never went into the pyramid or any of the pyramids. And one of the reasons that Harold cites is that there's the small square tunnel, which we've all seen in pictures and videos now, that one has to crawl through on all fours to get in to the inner area. And Harold's ridiculous assertion is that Napoleon would not have wanted to do this because it would be beneath his dignity. So therefore, he did not go into the pyramid. So here you have a guy who is a philosopher scientist at heart, who's in love with ancient history and is fascinated with these mysteries of the lost civilization. And he's led this expedition thousands of miles from home. And there he is at the greatest mystery, the last surviving wonder of the world. And he's not going to go inside because his ego won't let him crawl through a little tunnel. And remember, he's not 30 years old. He's in great physical shape. I mean, this was just a ridiculous assertion. So I'm looking at this, I'm going, no way. There's got to be more to this story. And what I was finding in other more recent biographies, more recent historians, is that indeed there were multiple biographers who cite actual documents that place Napoleon at the Giza Plateau several times and on particular days, and even witnesses that were there with him talk about him emerging from the pyramid to receive an important message, about the Turks at Abukir Bay and things like that. So clearly the historical record from witnesses and sources, people that were there, talk about Napoleon having been in the pyramids and the Great Pyramid more than once. So you ask yourself, okay, where did Harold get this? And basically the negative connotation, the story that he never went in because, his ego would not let him crawl, this seems to originate with Bourrienne. Bourrienne was a school chum of Napoleon's, who later on, when they're adults, became, his secretary, his official secretary. Well, the problem with Bourrienne is the man had issues. He was corrupt. He was untrustworthy. He got fired more than once by Napoleon for his, corrupt, dishonest practices and lack of ethics. And he became bitter. And so he started writing all this negative stuff and contributed to the lies and the propaganda, this anti-Napoleon stuff. Well, it didn't take long. Historians have long considered Bourrienne an undependable source. But, in the mid-20th century, people were still kind of taking Bourrienne at his word. Since then, in the last several decades, they pretty much see Bourrienne for what he was. So with the actual historical record, witnesses at the time, his contemporaries, people that were there, we learned that Napoleon did indeed go inside the pyramids, and particularly the Great Pyramid, and more than once. So that was a big step forward in trying to get at the truth of this interesting story about him spending the night in the king's chamber and coming out, all pale and shaken and wouldn't say what happened to him. Now we could say, okay, he really did go inside the pyramid. So, what would the next question be? Well, your question, was he expecting to find something? What was he expecting to find? What was he expecting to experience? That leads us to looking at the people around him. Now, we already know the names of, his influences. We know there's Masons among them, although Napoleon himself was never a Mason. And we know that he had these interesting philosopher-scientists who were his close advisors, the closest being Gaspard Monge, who went with him to Egypt. So I'm digging into Gaspard Monge because I'm thinking, okay, here's the guy who was his mentor in this search for the lost mysteries and all this stuff, okay? Here's the guy who, when the papyrus was found, he presents it to Napoleon, okay? So what possibly could Monge know about specifically the pyramid? So I dig into Gaspard Monge a little deeper, and I learned that he's the father of descriptive geometry. And I'm not even going to pretend that I'm a mathematician in any stretch of the imagination. It's in the book, but essentially the smoking gun is that Gaspard Monge had delved into and presented mathematical and geometrical theories that ultimately lead to what's called the Monge point. And I would have to have the book out in front of me, but the Monge point is a geometrical spot, kind of a sweet spot in I forget the word, pyramidal shapes, okay? And what I argue basically is that Napoleon went into the Great Pyramid and spent his night in the king's chamber because he and Gaspard Monge suspected that the sarcophagus inside the king's chamber, the alleged sarcophagus, the famous stone box without the lid, is where the sweet spot, the Monge point of the Great Pyramid would be located. Okay, now the Monge point specifically points to a particular other type of, I don't think it's a it's a particular type of pyramid.
Yeah, it is a tetrahedron.
Yes, it is a tetrahedron.
Yeah, I looked it up. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like the midpoint of a tetrahedron, something like that.
Yeah. Something like that. Yeah, you'd probably understand it better than I do.
No.
But here's the thing. I think they thought that this Monge point sweet spot would be located, as far as the Great Pyramid is concerned, its version of that would be inside that granite box, that so-called sarcophagus in the king's chamber. Now,
the
why
sarcophagus
it's important?
that there's never been a body in? Yeah.
Right, exactly. But it fits a body, someone laying down. Here's the thing. When you dig into the Monge point, this is where multiple planes, it's like an intersection of multiple planes. Okay? So think about that. If we know these things about pyramids, where there's this, we've heard about the concept of pyramid power. We've heard both Christopher Dunn and Joseph Farrell, among others, point to the engineering properties of the pyramid and presented very compellingly their theories that the Great Pyramid was some type of machine, some energy-generating machine. Okay, so now we're looking at the whole Napoleon episode from that perspective. And who does he have with him? His close mentor, Gaspard Monge, who happens to be the guy who theorized this sweet spot, at least, in tetrahedral pyramid physics. Why not, a pyramid like the Great Pyramid? And this is what I think and propose and speculate that Napoleon and Monge suspected they could find inside the Great Pyramid.
So was this supposed to be some kind of Was it like some kind of mind-altering thing or some kind of spiritual thing that it was supposed to affect on someone?
I think what then he did, they probably went in and did measurements and such, and Monge probably was confident that indeed the sweet spot, this Monge point sweet spot, was right there in that so-called sarcophagus. Okay, and from there, what Napoleon did was he laid down in the thing, like tourists do to this. A good friend of mine just got back from Egypt, and all he had to do was slip a few bucks to the tour guide, and his assistants held back the other people, kept them distracted, and my buddy got to lay inside the box there for a couple of minutes. So, but Napoleon, of course, he was controlling the whole thing, so he had hours, he had all night. And I think what he did was he got in there, he laid down. Now remember, as you read in the book, Napoleon from early on had been fascinated with and had been an enthusiastic practitioner of deep meditation. And he had said that meditation had allowed him to foresee things, possibilities and such. Almost, you get the feeling that maybe he's talking about the way Tesla used to see things materialize, in front of him, machines, without having to do blueprints. So it's almost kind of that quality. So here you have a guy who is, kind of a master of meditation, if you will, in the Great Pyramid, this possible machine that generates, maybe multi-plane energies, and he's in the Monge point sweet spot of that machine. So he lays down in the box, he applies his meditative methods, right? And what I think happened was he was indeed in the so-called Monge point of the Great Pyramid, and laying in that box and applying his meditative methods, I think his consciousness, his subconscious, tapped into another plane, okay? And he had some type of vision or dream vision that startled him. Now, what it was about, that's a whole other discussion. It could have, did he think he saw his future? Did he see multiple possibilities? What did he see? We don't know for sure, because as the story tells us, he emerges from the pyramid 7 hours later, shaken, pale, and when asked what happened, he stops himself and tells the person, "You wouldn't believe it anyway." But it's not long after that he indeed decides he needs to get back to Europe, and the rest is history. He goes on to victory, victory, victory. He becomes the first consul. He has a few great years of just doing wonderful things for France, and suddenly the dynasties in England are even more intent on stopping him. And he goes on to his great glories and what we know in history, of course, the big fall and such. So you got to ask yourself again, what happened to him in that pyramid? What did he see? Did he return to France at that time because he knew this is the time he had to act? We don't know. We can only speculate on that. But that's what I think happened to him in the pyramid. He went in there looking for that sweet spot, intending to do what he did, and he had some type of extraordinary subconscious or conscious, what's the word for it, waking vision, waking dream. And he learned something. He saw something that startled him, but set him on the course of the rest of his life.
When you wrote about that in the book, I could not help but immediately think about Crowley and the Great Pyramid.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
sure.
What happened there, and I guess where he was communicated the Book of the Law and all that. So I wonder if there's any connection there.
Well, that's what I was wondering. I mean, was this influx of Egyptian themes into occult figures and esoteric orders in Europe in the following years, was that really a result of the campaign of Egypt?
Absolutely. Egyptology, as we know it, the discipline, the scientific historical discipline of Egyptology, is credited with having its origin in the Napoleon campaign. When he took all those savants, he established a library, he established laboratories. The things he established, the historical research centers, these became the main establishments and institutions of Egyptology for the remainder of the 19th and going into the 20th century. So yes, absolutely. Europe's fascination with Egypt really ignited and took off because of Napoleon Bonaparte.
And the influence on occultism in particular.
Oh, certainly, yeah. Because again, we find out that Napoleon took these philosopher scientists with him, and also in his military staff, there were some pretty interesting guys who were most likely, if not Freemasons, they were in other societies. But you had Colonel Desai, who very interesting character, and among the generals had a reputation for being very cooperative with the philosopher scientists, who the other military staff were frustrated over their presence, even on the expedition. Desai, he was very cooperative with them, and they found, these experts commented how much Desai seemed to know about their disciplines. Now, here was a guy who was a military officer who hardly wore a uniform and kind of dressed slovenly, but was an excellent, soldier and all that. And he seemed to be a philosopher scientist-minded guy himself. And he was one of Napoleon's staff officers. Then you have Colonel de Hautpoul. Now, you should recognize that name in the Rennes-le-Château mystery, because it's Madame de Hautpoul, whose gravestone, grave marker, is involved in the whole Bérengère-Saunière mystery. Okay?
Nicolas Poussin.
The Nicolas Poussin painting.
Arcadia.
And here you have all that, Et in Arcadia Ego, that whole thing that you find in the Dan Brown and the Lincoln and Bejan, that Holy Blood, Holy Grail,
right.
All of that. Here you have Colonel de Hautpoul, who is a relative of, the same Madame de Hautpoul, and there he is from the family that's neck deep in this mystery, this Holy Blood, Holy Grail thing, and he is one of Napoleon's staff officers, and he's one of the two guys who discovered, allegedly stumbled, I say with quotes, upon the Rosetta Stone. Okay, so there's a guy right there, who's on a staff. And by the way, there was another officer, a young guy later on, who is a descendant of Nicolas Poussin, the artist who did the painting, in which it's the Shepherds, and Three Shepherds or something, I think the painting is technically called, but it's referred to from with the phrase Et in Arcadia Ego. So here you had Napoleon, almost surrounded by guys involved in that mystery. Okay, the whole Holy Blood, Holy Grail, Rennes-le-Château mystery. So he's surrounded by those kind of people. We know his interests. He has this weird experience in the pyramid. Absolutely, the influence on the occult, where Egypt is concerned, and Egyptian history and stuff like that really emerged, and as I said, ignited in the 19th century. Yeah, that in itself is also a result of Napoleon's expedition. Absolutely.
And like the Order of Memphis, we were talking about that.
Yeah, all
the connection to the Knights of Malta,
all the OTO origin stuff. The fact that wasn't Cagliostro like taught by a Maltese monk?
Yep.
I'm going in volume 2. What I did with volume 1 was I laid the basic foundation Okay, I present 3 hypotheses to lay a basic foundation, and in volume 2, it became this. I realized, okay, it'll be the basic foundation. In volume 2, I will go back and cover and dig into a lot of these threads, some of which you've mentioned here.
Cool.
People that are reading the book are asking questions, and I'm saying, hey, very good question, and that's the reason why I've got to do a volume 2, because now I will go back and I'll say, okay, here's those threads that popped up, when I was telling you before about Egypt, when I was telling you about his the genealogy, when I was telling you about the whole Napoleon in America section. Here's those loose threads. We're going to dig into that, and that's very much going to have to do with digging into the secret society, Masonic, and other such connection to the whole Napoleon mystery.
Cool. We look forward to it.
Yeah, we're going to get into that. Let's get into some of these forces that are arrayed against Napoleon. Now, normally people look at, that it was Britain, that it was kind of the forces of counter-revolution that still held a grudge against Napoleon for the French Revolution and everything that had happened there. But you maintain in the book that it goes deeper than that, and you kind of single in on one house in particular, the House of Este, which, if you do research on, essentially the royal family of Britain now is a branch of that, which is interesting. But the Hanoverians at the time when Napoleon was around were the one of the main branches.
Yes, it's like you cannot, as they say, swing a cat in Europe without hitting some member of the House of Este for the last, over 1,000 years, because they were in that dynasty had somebody, in every monarchy of Europe. It seemed like, they were just everywhere. And, when you look at the history of they called them the Allies back then, the Allied powers that were resisting Napoleon, there you can't deny there's the House of Este right there. Because as you say, in England, and England was they were like the lead attack dog in the whole thing against Napoleon. Now, the historical reasons are obvious. Of course, the British Empire was going strong and wanted to continue going stronger, okay? And they had been recently, essentially, let's call it what it is, they had been recently humiliated by their colonies in America, okay? So they were not happy with the young United States, which Napoleon greatly admired. Napoleon, you got to understand, as we know, the Enlightenment had been going on since the Renaissance, and the United States was the first nation that truly was a product of the Enlightenment as a nation. And here was France taking its lead. Now, Napoleon, of course, was was supportive of that and part of that spirit and everything. And as we know, in France, this kind of led to some anarchy and chaos, and it led to what they call the Terror. So suddenly all these great grand French revolutionaries, led by the Enlightenment, were now just acting murderous and like a bunch of bloodthirsty anarchists, and they were chopping heads off left and right. Now, it started with the royals and anybody who was against this Enlightenment revolution, but pretty soon they even started chopping off the heads of their own leaders, And by the time, at the height of the Terror, Napoleon was quoted, they've fallen into anarchy now. And he became, he was opposed to that. So he was part of, as a young officer, he was part of putting the Terror down and stopping that chaos, which it needed to stop. He was absolutely right about that. They had just slipped into this wrath, and it threatened to destroy France. So what Napoleon saw was that they needed to be practical in their application of the Enlightenment principles. And the reason that the House of Este and the oligarchs of Europe and England were so opposed to him was, England wanted their empire, okay? The oligarchs of Europe, they kind of wanted their thing to continue. And here was this Napoleon guy who got his country, his radicals in his country under control, but, continued France in the direction of Enlightenment principles. And after he went to Egypt and he came back and, he was running France, and then the Allies started 8 of the 9 Napoleonic Wars. Wherever Napoleon, conquered, wherever he went in Europe and conquered, he would change their government structure and apply Enlightenment principles. And this threatened the European oligarchs of the House of Este and, of course, their attack dog England. They didn't like this because what do Enlightenment principles do? They free up the common man from the chains of the feudal system, okay? And here you have England, as I said, fairly recently humiliated by their colonies in America, and now you have this Napoleon guy who's basically beating them at their own game. He's conquering, Europe and making it a better place than what he found when he, conquered it. And they didn't like that. They couldn't have that because the next thing they knew, is that their own people were going to be overthrowing them, and this just simply would not do. And that's a main motive for why they felt like they had to stop Napoleon. They certainly couldn't hold. There was no individual in England, or Europe at the time that could, a leader, okay, like this, that could really hold a candle to the guy, okay? And that scared them because people loved him. Even the lands where he conquered, people loved him. The people in England, when I'm negative or I'm critical of what I call the Brits in the book, for example, I'm speaking of their aristocracy, okay? I'm speaking of the oligarchs and the blue bloods, okay? The common people, they loved Napoleon. And that was the other thing that scared the hell out of England and their House of Este masters in Europe was that, the people loved this guy. And so, hey, he had to be stopped. And also he had to be lied about. They had to paint him like a monster. And that's what they did. And that's why they did it, was because people loved him.
Why was the House of Este so invested in trying to destroy him? What was the background there? And you do allude also to Venice having a beef with him.
Yes.
And the Prussians and this kind of shadowy group that is related to the Prussians, which is the Society of Lizards. And if anybody's ever read your other books or listened to our other interviews, Prussia comes up with Nimza as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, basically, you have the House of Este that was, very powerful, and their concern was, okay, how was Napoleon going to affect their dynastic power, their hold, right? But as you say, you also had Venice, the Venetian bankers, okay?
Which were instrumental, to tie it back in, were instrumental in the Fourth Crusade in getting the Crusaders to basically do their dirty work for them.
Exactly. Yeah. And because of Venice and their Machiavellian ways, and particularly, I think, because of what they did to their hand in, screwing with the Templars and, suppressing the information they had, just basically being, how we've learned that they are, and holding back and suppressing the information, it goes way back. Napoleon, knew that he had to crush them. He did not like what we call globalization, okay? He did not like the idea of banks controlling nations and populations and such. He did not like that. He knew that that's what the Venetians really were at heart. He felt he had to go in and crush them. And he did a good job, but unfortunately they had moved their headquarters before, the days where he conquered Italy. They had already really mostly shifted operations to Amsterdam and then on to London by that time. So you also had, so you had the House of Este, you had the Venetian bankers, okay, and you had the church, okay. There's the Pope and all the Vatican concerns, for their power. And Napoleon, although he for the most part would be basically respectful of the church in certain ways, he kind of thumbed his nose at Vatican power. Okay, at the same time, we know that he put under house arrest one of the popes, and he had personal philosophical views that that the church certainly wouldn't have supported. But mostly, the reason he bucked heads with the church, and they of course would have bucked heads with him, was over power. And yes, it does go back to the papal involvement in the Fourth Crusade, as you mentioned. So among the documents he was after any Vatican documents he could find. So you had all these players, and really what it comes down to, you can look at all the details and stuff, but what it comes down to is he threatened their power structure, okay, because he was brilliant, because he was fueled by Enlightenment principles, because wherever he went, the public, even the conquered public, tended to love the guy, and there was no stopping him, and that's what scared them. He just basically threatened their good thing.
And they used Britain as the premier naval power of the world to, and of course they had their own interests, but they used them to do so. And then this like the Society of Lizards, which I love that name, by the way. That's
yeah, and then interesting, and of course you get the inevitable people that say, "Oh, it's the reptilians."
Right.
We're not,
David Icke.
Yeah, we're not talking about reptilians. Yeah, we're it's the organization, a shadowy organization going back into the medieval era of the German territories. Okay, and they established themselves among the what's called the Beteljunkers, or the Junkers, element of society, and they used the Teutonic Knights for their objectives, to get power and wealth and to control the area. And what's interesting is the way they go about it, talk about Machiavellian, is they befriend a group like the Teutonic Knights, and they provide them resources, and they support them. They get ingratiated with them. They support them until they find the next group that can be useful to them, and then they buddy up to that next group and turn that group against the original group that they were friends with. And they did this to the Teutonic Knights, and they did this around the German territories. This group that was behind this Junkers movement and all this manipulation was the actual, when you go back, the original source of the German nationalism, of that Prussian movement to unify all the German territories, subsequent to the medieval era, and greatly launching and building steam during the Napoleonic era. Okay, so the roots of NIMSA, the German organization, the Prussian organization NIMSA, that I have written about elsewhere, and that others have talked about. Remember, NIMSA originates with Belschau, not with me. I've just fleshed it out, according to the clues he gives. This is all really building steam and speed during the Napoleonic era. So that's really interesting. And of course, yeah, that's something I'm going to go deeper into in Volume 2. In a lot of ways, Volume 2 is going to be even more fun than this first book, to be honest, because it's all that juicy stuff that you think, oh, but what about this? What about that? Yeah, that's what I'll be getting to, the this and the that. And so that's what you've got. What you've got really are the guys who would, become the Prussian Nimsa, who are among these enemies of Napoleon.
It sounds like we're coming to like all these players just keep coming up in all this material.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting.
See why I'm fascinated with the 19th century.
Yeah.
When you're talking about breakaway civilization, when you're talking about some of our mysteries that emerged in the 20th century and in our times, you go back to you keep going back to the 19th century. You see that's where these threads lead to when you follow the threads backwards, and that's why this era is so fascinating to me, because it had and continues to have huge impact on our lives, throughout the 20th century and even today.
So it seems like that was really a birthing of the 19th century. The conquest of Egypt.
Of what?
It seems like
yeah, you could say that.
The Egyptian campaign birthed a lot of strands of all this different stuff into the 19th century.
Sure.
And helped create what it was.
Yeah, absolutely. And Napoleon, to a basic degree, he and his associates were aware of this and were a huge part of that world. This is why in Volume 2, I go, one chunk of it will pull threads that emerged after his passing, after he's dead, because the man and the things he did and the things he put into place and was responsible for, a lot of these exist today. I mean, French law is still essentially based on the Napoleonic Code, very much so. Little things like, go out in front of your house if you live in a typical neighborhood in the suburbs, and look at the street addresses. Odd on one side, even on the other. That originated with Napoleon when he was kind of re-engineering the civic code and reorganizing France. That started with what Napoleon did in France. And here we still use this. And that's just a small thing. Napoleon Bonaparte, I say this in the book, and I stand by this. Clearly in the 19th century, there were two main figures that will be the ones 1,000 years from now that will be remembered, and that's Napoleon Bonaparte and Abraham Lincoln. No one else, comes close to them. And there were some great people in the 19th century and some great accomplishments.
You mean Chester A. Arthur is never going to be remembered?
Who? Chester Arthur?
He had some awesome sideburns. You got to give him that.
Gosh, sorry. But and maybe running a close third might be, depending upon how technology goes, Nikola Tesla, of course.
Sure.
Because if we were to ever really embrace his ideas, but you get the idea. Here's what's interesting. Here's of those three. Okay, if you want to throw Tesla in there, look at the kind of men we're talking about. Look what I lay out in the book, and we've been talking about what Napoleon was truly interested in. His first love was being a philosopher scientist kind of guy. Okay, then you have a guy like Nikola Tesla. Okay, and these two guys, one of them really kicks off the 19th century, and the other one emerges in the late part of the 19th century and is kind of part of that ushering in the 20th century. Okay, and in between them, you've got this somewhat mysterious figure of Abraham Lincoln, who that's a whole other series of books and shows right there. The odd mysteries of Abraham Lincoln. He was there's something about that guy, and people have really gone much more deeper into that than I ever had. So Napoleon's right in there with it. You have these three guys who have this either their interests or are extraordinary or they have some weirdness about them, And yeah, absolutely, Napoleon and you could add Tesla are the bridge to the 20th century from the late 18th century. Absolutely, they were laying that down.
Interesting point.
You could say that about a lot of eras, but really specifically in spades, the 19th century was really accelerating us into what we call the future.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean by that.
Agreed.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating century to explore. And I mean, you know, the 20th obviously was much more explosive in progress and war and all. But if you look at where the world was in 1800 and as opposed to where it is in 1900, I mean, it's a huge change.
Well, in the early 20th is impossible to understand without the context of the 19th. I mean, it's still so much like the 19th. I mean, World War I, you still got people on horses. It's still
yeah. The third section of the book, I thought this is some interesting stuff, and this is, I think, where you're going to further explore in the second volume. But it's this whole idea of Napoleon not dying on St. Helena, but living into some kind of old age. And I found this stuff really compelling.
Yes, indeed. I do too. And I can't tell you how excited I was as I'm reading the biographies. And when I first read that it was noted in their lifetime, okay, how much Napoleon and his brother Joseph resembled each other. They were told that all the time. And then you get to that day, those period of days after Waterloo, after they've fled Malmaison, and they're at the naval port of Rochefort. And you learn that not once but twice Joseph implored Napoleon to switch places with him. And history tells us that Napoleon said, no, I will throw myself at the gentlemanly mercy of my opponents. And he surrenders himself to the British ship, the Bellerophon, and the rest is history. He's taken to England, not allowed to get off the ship, and then, of course, they didn't tell him they were going to do this until the last minute. They take him off to St. Helena, and, you know, the poor guy withers away and eventually dies, and that's it. Well, I didn't buy that, because when you learn more of the details that Napoleon had himself already planned in detail to chuck it all and go to America, get to America, and spend the rest of his life designing and leading and providing resources for expeditions of South America and, you know, other parts of the North American continent that, you know, were still wild at the time. And, you know, you read that there was, when he was at Rochefort, he's informed that there was an American frigate 8 miles off the coast, and there were 2 U.S. naval officers, okay, who were there on hand with a small boat, a launch, rowboat or whatever, to take him to that American ship, and then they would sail on to America. And we're told that, you know, again, that Napoleon said, no, I'll throw myself on the mercy of the English. It doesn't make sense. Then when you read, it doesn't make sense to me. Then when you read that in the past, before Waterloo, before being banished to Elba and all that, he used to send his coach with a retinue of horses and guard off somewhere to one of the properties or out in the countryside to make enemy spies think that he was off on a hunting expedition. He either wouldn't be inside the coach or, gee, maybe did he have a double? You know, because there were multiple assassination attempts on his life starting in Egypt. they were constantly trying to assassinate him. A lot of this was uncovered. The British had their hands in it. They were paying assassins to try to kill Napoleon. So he had started using tricks and doubles to begin with, and that's something he used. And so, again, we come back to Rochefort, that fateful day, and suddenly he decides not to do that. No, I'll throw myself on the mercy. Okay? My gut told me, no. He took the offer. And I go in the book why. Okay, people say, well, why would Joseph do this? Number one, nobody knew that they were going to exile Bonaparte on St. Helena. Okay, first they had requested, and the Prussians blocked this. They had requested that when Napoleon abdicated, that he got to choose his location of exile, and he had already chosen the United States. Okay. And the Prussians blocked that. They said, no, he doesn't get to choose. Well, then the impression was, right up to the time that the Bellerophon sails with the Bonaparte exile into, the harbor in England, the impression is that, well, of course, they'll keep him under house and estate arrest somewhere in, north of London in the English countryside. Okay. And people say, well, why would Joseph volunteer to be in exile the rest of his life? Well, it was because he thought he would live in exile in a nice estate in the north of England, okay, which would be pretty nice, and he would be able to accept guests and visitors. Well, we know that didn't happen. In fact, the Bonaparte exile, as I call him, because I believe it was Joseph, was not allowed to leave the Bellerophon, not allowed to leave the ship. So then, his stuff is readied, and they set sail south towards, of course, the coast of Africa. And that's when they inform the Bonaparte exile of where they're going. So it wasn't until the last minute that Joseph would have found out that, he hasn't volunteered to be in exile in a comfortable estate in the north of England. He's going to be banished to a rock several hundred miles off the west coast of Africa. Yeah. Okay, but by this time he's committed. And, he loves his brother, and he believes his brother's freedom is important. So he figures, well, okay, I'll still get to live in a nice house and be well fed and tended and taken care of. And you got to understand, Joseph's ego was different than Napoleon's. Napoleon truly, when you read about him, really honestly didn't care that much about the pomp and circumstance. Would he engage in it? Of course he would. Because he said, hey, I'm the first consul. Now I'm the emperor of France. I'm going to do this because I am the emperor and for the glory of the country, blah, blah, blah. But Joseph was known to be the one who was more of the show-off, okay? So for Joseph, the good deal was, I'll still get my family, will still get to visit me. They'll just have to wink, wink, pretend it's Uncle Napoleon. And I'll have this great estate. Well, he finds out at the last minute it's going to be St. Helena, that rock. Okay. Then when he gets there, they find out that the house is kind of shitty, and things just go bad from there. But he's committed to this by now, because in my opinion, we are told by history that it was Joseph who came to the United States and lived in New Jersey and blah, 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 had parties and built a house. I think that was actually Napoleon.
Posing as Joseph.
Yes, posing as Joseph. And Joseph heroically, tragically, but heroically lived out the charade. And his health deteriorated. They treated him like crap at St. Helena, ostensibly because they believed it was Napoleon. There's some question that they suspected it wasn't Napoleon.
Yeah,
himself.
That was some of the most compelling stuff, was like where you had one of the physicians that was not sure if he was actually dealing with Joseph or Napoleon.
Right.
There was some suspicion, I think, on the governor of St. Helena's part as well, that he may not have the actual guy.
He was always excessively concerned that there would be a rescue attempt.
Yeah.
But it was De las Casas himself, one of he had gotten himself selected to be the guy who would be the biographer of Napoleon. And so he was spending all his time with who I think was Joseph. We'll call him the Bonaparte exile. And even he expressed a concern once that, if I didn't know better, I would think that this is not Napoleon, that this was Joseph. So if that little doubt is expressed, just sprinkled in history, you have to ask yourself, how much did the British suspect it in reality that they didn't say anything? Okay. Now remember, they had during the time post Waterloo, before the Bonaparte exile turned himself in. Okay. The English were concerned because they knew he wanted to go to America. They were concerned that he was going to pull something and get there before they could capture him. They had sent 2 British Navy frigates to the United States, and they were patrolling the harbor, I think it was off New York or Boston. It was one of the harbors, because they expected that Napoleon would pull something and arrive in America. So the British from the get-go were suspicious, that something would be pulled. And here you have the officials on St. Helena wondering if a switcheroo had been done. And of course, Napoleon would have had to have maintained the cover the best he could, because what would prevent the British from sending spies to the United States to kind of watch Joseph and try to determine if maybe, that was the case, if this was Napoleon. So there was a stake in Joseph maintaining, in spite of what happened to him, there was a very serious stake in him maintaining the charade, in my opinion, in my analysis here, in the speculation, because, it would have kept Napoleon alive.
There's also things that you reproduce in the book where I believe that, quote unquote, Joseph is being referred to as the emperor. And I don't know whether that's because he would have inherited the title or if that's because that's actually Napoleon.
No, it was a case of, that was when, it's very interesting, that was when, Joseph, I say with air quotes, who I believe was Napoleon, was walking down the street, I believe it was in Philadelphia, if I'm not mistaken. And a gentleman who had been, from my research, he had served Joseph and Napoleon, okay? And he was one of the Bonaparte exiles that came to the United States. There were a lot of them, and I will be getting into that in Volume 2 big time. But he was here in the U.S. He's walking down the street. Here he sees Napoleon with his associates and retinue, and he walks up and he goes, "Mon Emperor, I can't believe it's you." And we are told that Joseph says, "Oh, no, my good man, you're mistaken. I am his brother. I am Joseph." And this guy who had been in like the personal king, emperor's guard or whatever, said, no. I know my emperor when I see him. And Joseph, who we're told was Joseph, had to, emphasize, no, I am not him. I am his brother. And, the guy goes away not quite entirely buying it.
Do you know what year that
yeah,
was?
That right there. That off the top of my head, no. We're talking, oh gosh, it was within that first year after all the after Waterloo happened. So 15 or 16.
Because
I'd have to look at the book.
Looking at Wikipedia, of course, the Book of Knowledge, like the Bonapartist claimants, right? I'm looking at this list of Bonapartist claimants to the French throne since 1814. Mm-hmm. So Napoleon is defeated in 1815. Well, the claimant to the throne is actually Napoleon II, which is his son by the Austrian princess. And when he dies in 1832, Joseph is then it goes to Joseph. So that's 1832. So then Joseph, even by the Bonapartist parties or their faction, even by them, that he wouldn't even be called the emperor in 1815. It would have been Napoleon's son. So it's interesting that they're calling him emperor in some of the stuff.
No. What you got to understand? Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're right. I get your point, but you're right. But also, if you've been the emperor's, guard, essentially his close Secret Service guy,
right?
In their minds and hearts, Napoleon was forever their emperor.
Well,
in this specific case.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that lends credence to this, because no one would have referred to Joseph, even if if it actually was Joseph, or they just thought it was Joseph. They wouldn't have referred to him as the emperor until 1832. So that's another thing that lends credence to the theory that there could have been a switcheroo at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Oh yeah, and that's what I'm saying is there. When you look at the details, there's all these circumstances and all these details and such that really you have to ask yourself, my gosh, did they do this? Did they pull this off? And I think they did. That is why, I get to the third part of the book, and, you've read it. You remember the part in the beginning where I say, look, those of you who just really don't have patience with or can't abide with speculation, just put the book down. Don't read the third part. Because, for me, I know I'm going way out there. However, that said, I'm really confident in this because of these details we're talking about. That's, of course, why I wrote that part in the book and why I present them. It's just really, it's the most amazing enlightenment on really any historical figure I've ever studied. I went into this just knowing what most of us know or are told and taught about Napoleon Bonaparte, with a little hint of that philosopher-scientist interest of his. And I'm telling you right now, by halfway through the research process, I became a great admirer of Napoleon Bonaparte. I became a Bonapartist. This was one of the greatest men who ever lived, who was one of the most slandered great men in the history of humankind. I agree with the biographer Andrew Roberts. He should be like Alexander, like Catherine, like Frederick. Napoleon should be referred to as Napoleon the Great, because he earned it. It's deserving. What the British historians did to him for 200 years is insidious and deplorable, and it should be cast aside, and shame on them. Well, we understand why they did it, but still, it was just reprehensible. That's where I was by halfway through the research. A great admiration for this guy. You have this fondness for him because you see that really for most of this time he was that young idealist guy and not this despot tyrant. He made mistakes. He's not like this immortal, perfect demigod. Of course he made mistakes. My gosh, but I am a great admirer.
Yeah, I mean, I like Napoleon. I don't think he was that bad, honestly. He was probably no worse than anybody at his time. He's often been compared to like Hitler and stuff, but in no way that he was like Hitler.
Oh.
I mean, there were things that happened.
No,
I mean, Seraphiel's got this little reproduction of the Goya, the horrors of war. I mean, there was definitely some things that happened, but there was just as much atrocity and such that went on in the French Revolutionary Wars when Napoleon wasn't around.
Sure.
And there was a lot of things on all sides.
The period of the so-called Napoleonic Wars, there were 9 of them. 8 of them were started by the Allies.
Well, Britain just kept fighting.
The Brits, what?
Britain just kept fighting.
What?
I mean, there was only like a space of like not even a year that they were actually at peace.
Yeah, Napoleon only actually officially started one of those 9 wars. So why call them the Napoleonic Wars? Why not call them the wars of British and Prussian aggression? Why not?
That sounds familiar.
Why not call them the wars of European oligarchical aggression?
Well, what we call the Civil War down here.
I know. Okay, there's an interesting thing that is also going to be part of Volume 2, is the Bonapartists in America, and it's very interesting. I don't want to go into it here, but it's going to be real. Like I say, Volume 2 is in some ways going to be just as much, if not more fun than Volume 1. But, the whole thing about Napoleon, this comes up. Well, what about Nostradamus? And when I get done laughing uproariously and and attempt to answer the question, here's the thing. All this BS about Nostradamus having identified Napoleon as the second Antichrist or the first or whatever, okay? That was anti-Napoleon propaganda nonsense that was created by a guy who was using a gross mistranslation of Nostradamus, okay, like 100 years or so ago, okay? It is known that the translation that guy was using of the Nostradamus stuff that he cites, it became known that it was a gross mistranslation, and here he was fabricating crap, basing it on a mistranslation. And I'm not kidding you. There's intelligent people now who are stubbornly say, no, he was in Nostradamus. And I point that out to them, and they don't want to hear it. It's in Nostradamus. Nostradamus says it's kind of like with Crowley, like what I discovered in Empire of the Wheel.
Yeah.
I go into it knowing, what we're taught about Crowley, ooh, evil, dark guy, and I come out realizing that's not true at all. And I have a different view of Aleister Crowley. Well, the same thing with Napoleon. The Nostradamus stuff is BS. People need to just trash that thing where Napoleon is concerned. And then the whole thing recently with this is really hilarious. This comes up too. This story that they exhumed Napoleon's remains and they found an implant in his skull.
Oh yeah. I remember you posted about this. Was this like an alien implant?
I traced that. Okay,
must have been the Society of Lizards.
Exactly. The story originates in the 1990s with the tabloids, with World Weekly News specifically. It's a load of crap.
That's a trustworthy news
it was
source.
Making the rounds. Yeah, it was making the rounds here a few years ago. Well, here's the irony. Okay, so they pulled the bones out of Napoleon's crypt. Well, I argue those were Joseph's bones to begin with. So it wasn't even Napoleon's skull to begin with. But then I would ask people, I go, do you really think that France is going to allow these, woohoo scientists to pull the bones of Napoleon Bonaparte out of his crypt in Les Invalides? Okay, that place called Les Invalides where it's at.
Yeah.
No, they're not. This is BS, people. But you still have people that will just kind of withdraw and say, "Well, you just don't know what you're talking about, Walter." And I'm like, okay, all righty, woohoo, woo-woo. It's just funny. But the Nostradamus thing is crap. It's nonsense.
It's the Illuminati, man.
People should just, yeah.
They put an implant in Napoleon, dude. Did you hear?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know.
Oh, man. Pass the ball, bro.
Yeah. The stuff that people want to latch onto and not let go of, even when you point out, the evidence against it, they just don't want to hear it.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It's religion.
It really is. It really is.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Walter, thank you so much. I mean, this has been a real pleasure to talk about this with you. Where can people get the book? And I guess we kind of know, but what's next?
Well, the book, of course, my books can only be found print on demand at lulu.com. That's LULU.com. If you put in my name, it'll take you to a page where all my books are at, fiction and nonfiction. But it'll take you to a sales page if you put the title in where you can get this specific book, if you're looking to get this book, The Esoteric Napoleon. And let's see. I, of course, am beginning the early stages of working on Volume 2 of the Esoteric Napoleon. Of course, I've been working a lot with, or I should say talking a lot with, and answering a lot of questions for the producer that's developing the Empire of the Wheel TV series. That's going really well. And I have a couple of speaking events coming up soon. I'm going to be speaking at MUFON Orange County, their group, in May, a couple of weeks. And then I'm going to be speaking at a conference. They haven't named it yet, but it's tentatively scheduled for late September. When more details emerge on that, I'll be able to kind of promote that on my social media, so those of you that are there can look for that. And I think Esoteric Napoleon Volume 2 is going to keep me pretty busy as a writer for the remainder of the year.
Excellent. Seraphiel, was there anything else that you wanted to add, or?
No, it's just really fascinating. I haven't read it yet. I really look forward to reading it.
Well, thank you guys for having me, and
Yeah.
as usual, showing the interest in the book. I'm really proud of this particular book. I enjoyed talking about it with you guys, really. And I look forward to talking about Volume 2 with you.
Yeah, and we just scratched the surface of what's in it. So there's a lot more to it. So,
yep, definitely.
Excellent, Walter. Well, stay on the line for us. We're going to close this section out, but we'll be back to close out the show on Conspirinormal. Well, I noticed that you've been listening to your ways to achieve success, and that you're starting your Fortune 500 company.
Yeah, I'm trying to hypnotize myself into success.
So we've got a sponsor called, you may have heard of it, called ZipRecruiter.
No, I've never heard
And
of it.
you
Tell
can
me about it.
further hypnotize yourself into success. And if you want to help us and help the show and ZipRecruiter, on behalf of our partner, ZipRecruiter, here's why ZipRecruiter is the smartest way to hire. ZipRecruiter's powerful matching technology identifies people with the right skills, education, and experience, and actively invites them to apply to your job so you get qualified candidates fast. It's no wonder that ZipRecruiter is rated #1 by employers in the U.S. Thus, rating comes from hiring sites on Trustpilot with over 1,000 reviews. And right now, if you go to ZipRecruiter.com/Conspirinormal, you can try ZipRecruiter for free. That's ZipRecruiter.com/Conspirinormal, and keep listening to your self-help records.
Hey, that was pretty cool, man. I think.
Yeah.
Hey, I think if you guys got a problem with that, we can just play it backwards subliminally through the entire episode.
We could do that. Can you do some backmasking?
Yeah, of course.
All right. So, ZipRecruiter.com/Conspirinormal, guys. Check it out.
And now, back to the show.
Why not, have some backmasking? I think, I think we might have some backmasking going on in certain sections of our show. That could be a possibility.
Who knows?
People all of a sudden want to donate $1 to Conspirinormal. Which, yeah, we're doing the advertising, but we're also still have Patreon. It's still there. And we just did a Patreon episode with Walter Bosley, which you guys are going to hear in about 2-3 days after this drops. And we talk more about his book about the Esoteric Napoleon. We talk about the Napoleon bloodline and a couple of other interesting subjects too. So that's going to be available for the Patreons. And guys, you can join and become a Patreon and listen to all the stuff that's on there. I think it's about 30 different little Patreon episodes that we have done.
We've been getting a lot more prolific with that.
Plus the latest Romper Room number 6 is up there, which Romper Room number 7 will be on the main feed. So that is there. Guys, check it out. $1 just gets you in. That's less
lot of
than
extra stuff. Yeah,
That's right. So I would like to get your thoughts on that interview.
That was very interesting. I hadn't been able to read the book yet, but now I'm looking forward to it. In a lot of things I've been studying lately, I've really been going back to the 19th century roots of a lot of things that happened in the early 20th century. And even though it's so obvious, I never really thought of that being kind of, it seems like his conquest of Egypt really was the dawn of the 19th century. And you can see dramatic currents springing from that into this weird shit we're into.
Yeah. And Napoleon is one of those figures that for me, I there's an actual good, if you can sit through it, it's about 5 or 6 hour long miniseries that I think A&E did about like the middle of the 2000s, just simply called Napoleon. And it's good. It kind of gives you a good kind of primer on the life of Napoleon and who he was, and his relationship with Josephine, and the relationship with Talleyrand, the foreign minister, who we didn't mention in very much, but who kind of really sabotaged Napoleon behind the scene. And he was someone that Napoleon called shit in a silk stocking. That was actually a quote. And I think you took like foreign relations and stuff like that back in college. Was that what you did?
Yeah, international relations.
Yeah. Well, Talleyrand is considered one of the, prime diplomats that formed the whole idea of all that. So, I don't see Napoleon as like a Hitler type of figure. There were some things that happened. We talked about. You've got this little Goya reprint up here, which is the horrors of war from the Peninsular campaign.
Well, besides, it's just that classic Republican antagonism between a popular tyrant who does fix a lot of things, help a lot of people, but sacrifices a lot of the democratic ideals in the process also. So it's complicated.
Yeah, it is complicated. Beethoven, when he extolled Napoleon, he loved Napoleon. He saw him as this very virtuous. A lot of the early romantic poets saw Napoleon as very virtuous. But when he declared himself emperor, Beethoven actually tore up the symphony that he had dedicated to Napoleon because he was so disgusted by it. He's kind of, in many ways, really the first kind of modern leader in a lot of ways too. The emperorship was just kind of that was just to get people on his side, start this whole, give the aura of royalty, but not actual royalty, just kind of a tight central authority.
Well, like he talked about tonight, the Christ ritual being something that's enacted throughout time, and someone being elected to be this messianic figure.
Yeah.
Just like that, it's very similar with Napoleon, and back to the Roman times, this idea of a historical mission of the emperor, but still being a part of this Republican ideal, and that it's just this classic antagonism, and it reminds me of the Dune books too, where like young Paul feels like there's this historical mission that he's that chooses him more than he chooses, and that he has to write things in the universe, and a lot of eggs are going to get cracked in the process.
Because if you look at Napoleon, he was really the events that surrounded him propelled him to where he needed to be. Like, he never would have been anything but maybe some kind of common soldier.
Time makes the man.
If the revolution had never happened. If the revolution had never descended into a republic, it descended into some kind of chaos, he would have never been able to rise to the position that he did.
Yeah, that's
he was very, very lucky at certain points whenever the government would fall and he would have a protector in that government. He was able to, get to not go to the guillotine at a certain point, So all these given the chance at 26 years old to lead the army of Italy, he would have never risen had probably like all these other men gone to the guillotine, essentially.
Yeah.
Had they not been killed in either the war sparked by the French Revolution or by the terror that happened during the French Revolution, then Napoleon may not have gotten where he would have gotten, or gotten the chances that he would have gotten.
Yeah.
So he was, right place, right time, essentially, if you look at the history. So, very interesting. I really enjoy talking about history in this podcast. I don't get to do it a lot.
Yeah.
It's one of my main passions. I don't really get to talk about it a lot.
It's really fun to speculate with, because we have so much material,
Yeah.
I mean, what we were talking about tonight, and what they, glistened from Egypt, it took a long time to actually get anything out of that, and a lot of it was really speculative, and you still see that in a lot of mysticism today, where a lot of stuff is based on 19th century interpretations of Egyptian stuff that wasn't even necessarily true.
Right.
But his actual life and conquests are very well documented. We have so much material to work with. But very fascinating tonight.
Yep, and that's the kind of stuff you guys get when you listen to Conspirinormal, guys. We're delivering a great product, and we're trying to hit things to keep the show going. Like we said, patreon.com/Conspirinormal.
Yes, sir.
Like I said before, join as much as $1. And really, guys, in my estimation, like if I've got 1,000 people to listen to the show and they give $1, just do the math. That would be something that really help us out.
You can make us thousandaires.
Yeah. We can continue to pay for Rob's booze and our tiki drinks. All right, guys, thank you so much. We're going to be back next time with another guest. I think it's going to be interesting. But Seraphael, I don't think you will be here for that one.
I think I will be missing in action. I think I will be in sunny San Diego area.
Right.
Or on a plane coming back, probably.
Yeah, probably. In transit. All right, guys. Thank you for listening, and we will be back next time on Conspirinormal. I'm Merovingian descent.